uh, our Constitution says this is a government of we the people. Um, and according to our Constitution, we are all citizens of a republic, and we're obviously all human beings. And the question that I want to raise is, um, if this is a republic based on a citizenry in which we are all fellow human beings, um, what's the principle upon which that should be run? And in order to get at that, I think you have to first look at the question of what is a human being and what is it that distinguishes the human species from all other creatures that we know of. Um, Now, obviously, that there could be a discussion which takes weeks to pursue, but I'm just going to touch on a couple of things which I think are important. Um, in between 1858 and 1860, when he was running first for the U.S. Senate and then running for president, Abraham Lincoln had a favorite speech he delivered on a number of occasions. And the speech was entitled Discoveries and Inventions. You can read it. It's in the public domain. You can get it on the internet. And in that speech, what he talks about is that, what has been the driving force, what has been the catalyst for all the progress of human civilization has been individual discoveries and inventions. Because, you can look at a beaver that builds a dam or a bird that builds a nest, but the ancestors of these beavers and birds were building the same kind of dams and same kind of nests 20,000 years ago. Meanwhile, in those 20,000 years, we've gone from using tools made out of flint and stone to having human beings walk on the moon. Where has this come from? Right? And you'll get a lot of people with a lot of different opinions about that. But if you look at the progress of human civilization, say over the last 10,000 years, or you could go back much, much further, none of it has to do with money. None of it has to do with trying to make more money, as Adam Smith would say. Um, all human progress has been the product of a discovery or an invention, which has its origin in the human mind. That's what sets us apart from dogs and cats and cows and everything else. We are willfully creative, and that makes us unique as a species made in the image of God, the image of the Creator. And you could go back to the discovery of the use of fire. You can go through the invention of charcoal, the invention of metallurgy, the invention of bronze, the first machines. You could go to Benjamin Franklin's revolutionary work in electricity. And Ben Franklin was not a tinkerer. He was the greatest scientist of his era. And you can look at these things. You can look at the discovery of nuclear power, and what these discoveries and inventions have done has led to leaps in human productivity, in the power of the human species over nature, which is why all the environmentalists are crazy. They want us to go back to nature. But when you get to the question of the United States, what you get to is the creation of a republic which has inherent in its founding principles this notion of what a human being really is. Because if you look at European history, including the Roman Empire, including all of the empires, including feudalism, including life under all of the European monarchies, people were essentially slaves, serfs, underlings, and what was, I would argue that one of the major things that was denied to the human population over, say, the last 4,000 or 5,000 years, the overwhelming majority of the human population, is that this potential to be creative, to make discoveries, to change the future. A profound scientific discovery changes future potentials for human existence. That this was essentially denied to the overwhelming majority of the population, who were kept backwards and not educated, and that in that kind of a setup. And what you had with the United States was a republic that was founded on the idea of freedom. But it wasn't just freedom from tyranny. It wasn't just freedom from the British Empire. It wasn't just freedom from oppression. But it was the freedom to have a nation in which the actual nature of what it means to be human could be realized, in which every newborn child from whatever walk of life would have the opportunity to develop creative potentials, to make discoveries of their own, to become scientists, doctors, engineers, this, that, and the other thing, no matter what status they were born into. And this is what it meant to be an American citizen. A productive economy in which everyone take part. Now, what has happened over the last 4 to 5 decades, and it's not that I feel sorry for people, because it's life, but one of the problems, and I know there are people here today who fit into this category, it's not an accusation, it's way beyond your control, but one of the problems with people who are under 50 years old, or certainly under 40 years old, is you have no idea what a productive economy is. Literally no idea, because you've never lived in one. You really don't know what a productive economy is. You don't know the tens and tens and tens of thousands of factories, energy projects, infrastructure projects, water projects, the power of the American economic machine that existed from World War II all the way down to the mid to late 1960s. There was nothing like it in human history. Nothing like it. And the power of that economic machine also allowed for the development of a productive, affluent middle class. Something, again, which never before existed in human history. Oh, sure, you always had a middle class in all these countries. There's a middle class in Germany. There's a middle class in lots of other places. Middle class probably in China, in Japan, in India. But it was a small percentage of the population. The overwhelming majority of the population were poor. And what you got in the United States was this development of this productive and widespread middle class, highly paid, highly productive. I mean, you know, people talk about living standards, and they never think about certain simple things. In 1955, 1960, 1965, a working class adult, usually a man, but, you know, in most cases, but a working class adult who had a productive job working in a steel mill, auto factory, housing construction, farmer, whatever. You know, an adult man with a productive job could own a home, have a wife who usually didn't work or at most worked part-time, and 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 children, and support all of them in a middle-class lifestyle on one income. One income. Now, today, you know, a couple where both people work full-time are lucky if they can own a home and support 1 or 2 children. Do you recognize that's a 50% drop in income? Because it now takes 2 full-time incomes to support a lifestyle that even begins to approach the standard of living in 1955 or 1960 or 1965. That's a 50% drop in the standard of living. Now you could say, well, we had women's liberation, women wanted to get into the workforce. Okay, I'm not going to argue that point. The point I'm making is different, which is, you know, it takes 2 incomes now to have the same standard of living. Beginning in the 1970s and then escalating in the 1990s, our productive economy has been shut down, literally shut down. That's why, I mean, people don't know what a productive economy is. It doesn't exist. You know, in the 1920s, Oakland was known as the Detroit of the West Coast. There were auto plants all over the city of Oakland. You know, it's all gone. It's all gone except small pockets. You know, a fragment of the auto industry is left, and it's going fast. The aerospace industry is not in good shape. You know, you take these away, there's not much left except for the companies that build weapons. You know, there's not much left. Oh, sure, you got Silicon Valley. You know, but what do you have? You have a service economy now. A lot of low-wage service jobs, and then otherwise people making money in finance, you know, and in I don't know, finance, real estate, things like that. Speculative income, speculation, financial speculation. None of it's productive. So, you know, we have to get back to being a productive economy. Now, what I was really going to talk about, but I'm going to cut it very short, is I was going to talk about the question of national banking. Because as we were discussing, some of us were discussing earlier at dinner, the wrong question is big government versus small government. It's the wrong question to ask. The question is, in a republic of citizens, what is the proper role of government? If you're one of these people who say, you know, well, we should just get rid of government, well, good luck, you know? Good luck, you know? You want to live like the animals in the jungle? You know, you want to live in Haiti? You know, you must have a government. And the government of 300 million people must have fairly extensive powers. They must. So the question arises, what is the proper role of government? And my argument to you would be, and we could take this up if people want. If not, we don't have to. Is that if we are going to actually rebuild our productive economy and create tens of millions of high-wage, productive jobs, that we have to return to national banking. We have to establish a national bank like Alexander Hamilton and like Abraham Lincoln did through his greenback policies and national banking policies. We have to have a means of directing the flow of literally trillions of dollars into productive investment, not speculative investment, productive investment. And the only way to do that is through a national bank. And you know, some people say, well, we don't want the government running the banking system. Well, that's not what a national bank is. You know, do you realize right now you have a financial dictatorship in this country under the Federal Reserve? It's a dictatorship, folks, and that they've destroyed our banking system. I'll give you one statistic, which I did write down before I left home. In 1966, now this is, you know, right after the end of the Kennedy administration, we were getting into some problems, but in 1966, we still had a damn good economy, productive economy. In 1966, and this is with all of Franklin Roosevelt's regulations, in 1966, we had 24,000 banks in this country. I don't mean branches. I mean individual bank corporations. We had 24,000 banks in the United States in 1966. You know how many we have today? 5,000. We've lost 80% of the number of banks in this country. Again, not branches, but banks. Almost all of the banks we've lost are small and medium-sized banks, what they used to call community banks. And what was the role of community banks? Community banks were there to make loans to local businessmen, local farmers, people who wanted to build factories. They were there to provide credit for their communities. And this has all been wiped out by the Federal Reserve and the policies of the Federal Reserve, who are only interested in the major Wall Street banks and the ones tied in with them. A national banking system, a national bank in which we get rid of the Federal Reserve, we can begin to reopen and recapitalize banks all across the United States. We can begin to rebuild a private banking system, a system of private banks, but which operate, you know, under the auspices of the national bank, but which are privately owned. But we begin to direct credit away from Wall Street, away from financial speculation, away from the offshore banking system, away from the hedge funds and the wealth funds and the other funds and all this, you know, gambling, financial gambling. And we begin to direct credit into productive activity. And this is the kind of economy we have to rebuild. And we have to have education in this country and a culture in this country which is going to encourage the inventive genius of children. Who's going to be the next Thomas Edison? Who's going to be the next whoever? Elon Musk, you know, whether you like him or hate him. You know, who is going to be, you know, the next discoverer of something which will revolutionize the future, you know? And this is what we need to encourage. That's the proper role of government. So I'll end my remarks there and turn it over to Andrea.
Okay. Well, as some of you know, I've recently written a book about California history, but it's really more to it than that. I got started on the project. In fact, I didn't even plan to write a book, but we had a number of young people running for office about 15 years ago, including one guy in San Francisco who was running against Pelosi. And one of these campaign workers, the young person, came to me and said, "Well, can you give us some history of San Francisco?" And I said, "Well, maybe." And I realized I didn't know that much about it. And I realized I should know more about it because it's certainly relevant. So I started looking into it because I had to ask myself the question, what are we actually doing here? Is it even worth campaigning? And, are we wasting our time in California? There's so many crazy people. The culture is so degenerate. Maybe we should just go somewhere else. So, what I ended up finding out was that there is an incredibly rich history of political fights in California, going back to the gold rush days. And that what actually stands out is that you had really some of the most outstanding and you could say heroic leaders in the country emerged in that situation. Um, and I talk about, in the book. Actually, I have a few slides I can show if you want.
Where are they going to show up?
They're going to show up on the screen.
You're going to turn it around?
Yeah. So just for fun, that's what San Francisco looked like
Turn it around a little more.
In 1847. That's right before the gold rush, but after the Americans had taken over California. And there it is. From that's Yerba Buena Cove on the like at the end of Market Street and end of Embarcadero there. All right. So then, by a few years later, you had it looking like this. That was after the gold rush, and it was settled very fast and very haphazardly, and it was quite a wild place. That's Portsmouth Square in the 1850s. That's looking up towards Telegraph Hill. That's the actual mechanical telegraph on the top of the hill. But that's what it looked like, and that was the center of town. That had been the center of the town in the Mexican days, and that's where kind of everything took place. And this is an admission celebration. Admission Day finally happened on September 9th, 1850, when California was admitted to the Union. Actually, the celebration was 2 months later when the news got here. But anyway, that was that's Portsmouth Square again. And these kind of big demonstrations and big public gatherings were kind of the norm in those days. They gathered for a lot of different reasons, some good, some bad. So it turns out that one of the leaders of this whole effort, you don't have to hold that all day, was a guy named David Broderick, who was a Democrat, who was from New York. And he ended up, he came out here and got involved in politics, and he ended up fighting it out for the whole decade with what happens to be the other fact within the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was more divided then than the Republican Party is today. Because you had the pro-slavery Democrats that were trying to run the party, and you had he with his New Yorkers trying to do otherwise. And I'm not going to go into the whole story of it. You'll have to read it in the book. But just to give you a sense of some of the fights that went on, this again is Portsmouth Square, and I don't know if you can see it, but this is a guy being lynched. And this is where they had this vigilance committee emerge in 1852 in response to supposed excess crime. And there was crime, but from what the statistics of the police indicate is that it wasn't even as bad as it is now. But anyway, people were going to take matters into their own hands, and here you had this crowd organized, and as you see, they're stringing up a guy. So Broderick gets in the middle of this crowd and gets up there. Well, it was the next day with his actually, even that day, he got up on a wagon and denounced everybody for doing this and for violating the law and violating the Constitution. And then the next day they had another gathering there, and he organized 50 of his tough guys to come and help him break up the whole mob. And he practically got killed in the process. He gets up on the stage and again makes a big speech about about the Constitution and the law and so on, and practically gets ripped to shreds. So he used his tough guys to intervene and kind of break up the crowd, and that didn't totally work, but it had an effect, and it showed that courage works, and that people that stand up for the truth, that has a real effect in the world. And anyway, so this went on, and then a few years later, they reconvened. They took over a whole building and created their own courts and laws, and then they hanged people from their building that they decided were convicted, that were felons. So this is what was going on in San Francisco. So if you think it only started being crazy recently, it wasn't. This is the building that took over. I don't know if you could see that. Anyway, Broderick got elected to the U.S. Senate in 1857, and his first act in office was to stand up to the Democratic administration, which was at that time James Buchanan. And it was over the issue of slavery. And it was because the Buchanan administration was supporting a pro-slavery constitution for Kansas, which had been completely fraudulently elected. I mean, they had vote fraud in those days too. And they pushed through this constitution because they were trying to create another slave state. And the president says that this should be the acceptable constitution. And he gets up and says, I'm not going to stand for this. Just because I'm a Democrat doesn't mean I'm going to support, slavery in Kansas, even if I help get this president elected, and even if I'm a Democrat. And from that time on, he was like a marked man. He was, and it was the Democratic Party was in California split. It later split nationally. They were holding meetings denouncing him and demanding he follow the instructions of the state Democratic Party and the state legislature, and he just refused, and it just escalated and became a bigger and bigger fight. In 1859, they had elections, and it was a very really violent campaign. People were going around making speeches and counter speeches, but it was building toward a crescendo, which ended up happening. Long and the short of it is he gets forced into a duel and gets killed in a duel in San Francisco. Actually, it was right outside the city limits in Daly City. But it's because he was willing to stand up for the truth, and he wasn't willing to back down and be a politician or compromise, or all the things that people say you have to do to be in politics these days. And what you'll see is there are a number of people like that who are not willing to play the game, who are not willing to, go along to get along. Another guy who these are three different pictures of the same guy. His name is Edward Baker, and he was actually a close friend of Abraham Lincoln's. He came from Illinois, and he was the guy that helped found the Republican Party in California. He actually made friends with Broderick and supported him during that 1859 campaign, and said we should unify the best of the Democrats who want to go against this corrupt administration, who are trying to force through these policies of the slaveocracy, and we should instead work together, for the good of the country. And he fought for that kind of a unity ticket. But he also was a very eloquent speaker, and he made speech after speech, in which he just reached out to people and brought out the best in people and challenged them on the questions of American history and what the United States is all about. He made this really incredible speech in a place called the American Theater. long and the short of it is, he ends up after this going to Oregon and getting elected senator in Oregon, and then he comes back on his way back to Washington, and this is right before the election of 1860, and he makes this incredible speech in which he rallies the whole population to why they should vote for Lincoln and why they should abandon all this other stuff. And he succeeds in turning them around. Now, this is a democratic state. This is a state that had never gone for any. I mean, in the previous election, the presidential election, the new Republican Party ran a candidate who got 20% of the vote in California. So, which was way behind other northern states. And so, with his organizing and with the situation created in the aftermath of the death of Broderick, where people were rallied to the idea of standing up for principle, Lincoln ended up winning California, not with a majority, but with a plurality in a four-way race. And he then went off and ended up becoming a general in the Civil War. Following this guy came along who was quite remarkable. His name is Thomas Starr King. Any of you ever heard of him? He's a little bit more known than the other two. His church, actually the third, he was the minister of the Unitarian Church. The first one was actually there were two down by Union Square at Geary and no, that's where the one is now, is at Geary and Franklin. The original one was down by Union Square. And actually then he built another one also in that area. But the one that followed, for some reason, that one was moved again. And that church is now at Geary and Franklin, and that's actually where he's buried. You know, that's one of the few graves that are allowed to be left in San Francisco, but it's
right up the street.
Yeah, right down the street from here. But I mean, the problem is you don't even know about him. You know, now this guy went around during the Civil. He was a minister, but he was also a public speaker, and that was part of what they did in those days. People went out and they made speeches and they talked to people, and they had very extensive and in-depth discussions on all kinds of subjects. And he took it upon himself not only to speak on some of these very intense things, as he had been doing before. He came from Boston originally, but also as the war came on, he took it upon himself to rally the population to support the Union in the war. Because I don't know if you know this, but California actually was in danger of secession. There was actually a very strong secessionist element. It was the Democratic Party was totally run by the Southerners, and the Southern politicians were all of the slave owner class, and even though slavery was not legal in California, they had the whole state voting on the side of the South every time because it was run by these politicians. So and you had politicians going around the state. You know, when South Carolina was seceding, and others were saying, "Well, California should secede also and form a Pacific Republic, and you know, go its own way, and we shouldn't get involved in this slavery issue, and it's not our problem." And you had all this kind of stuff going around. So he decided to take it upon himself to change the whole direction of the way people were thinking. And that's what he did. He didn't know he was going to be doing that when he came here in 1860, but that's what happened. Now this is a speech he made on, well, it's this same day. This is Washington's birthday, 1861, and this big rally. This is at Market and Montgomery, where you had. It's hard to see in this. Maybe I can make it a little bigger.
It's all right.
Anyway, you know, you see them out there with the banners saying the Union, the whole Union, and nothing but the Union, and you have all these wagons and all this stuff. And people would come out for this. So there were like 14,000 people that came out on Washington's birthday in 1861. And it was a pro-union rally, and he spoke later that night, and he gave just this rip-roaring speech in defense of, about Washington, um, and used it to say, how can you think that for a minute Washington would be amenable to having himself buried in territory run by rebels who wanted to destroy the Union, which he would have given his whole life to, and did offer up his whole life to create and to save and to develop. Um, and he just ripped up every one of the arguments of the slaveocracy, and he just kept on and on. So this was just the beginning, and what would happen is that he started making a series of speeches at every opportunity that he could get to, and he was known as a public speaker, and he would go around, and he was making some of his previous speeches that he had made before in Boston and the Northeast, and these were of a very in-depth nature. These were not rah-rah speeches. These were hour and a half, 2-hour speeches. One of his famous speeches was called "Substance and Show," in which he proves that you don't know anything just by what you see. That your senses don't tell you anything. That it's your mind through which you know anything. And he goes through example after example of how you take anything, like you think this thing is hard. It's not hard. It's nothing but a bunch of atoms unless it's pulled together by cohesive force. And he goes into all of the different science between non-living things, between living things. He says, look, all living things are made up of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen. What is it that makes them all into something, so many massive varieties? Well, it's because there's a force behind it that you don't see. You don't know anything based on what's in front of your eyes or your ears. And he says, and then you go higher. You go to the realm of human nature, and what could be more, what's more real is the body or the soul. Well, a soul without a body, a body without a soul is nothing, is much less real than the soul itself. And he goes through many examples of this. The question of character, that this is the most powerful force that runs nations, that determines history. He talks about the character of Washington, and he says this is something that's a living force today, that this is not just something about past history, but the fact that Washington lived and did what he did and fought and sacrificed and so on, that becomes a living force in our generation now and gives us the means to fight the kind of fights that we're fighting. And he had one after another. He had these patriotic speeches, but then he also had these philosophical speeches. He had one on Socrates, for instance, in which he goes through the whole life of Socrates, and
I bet if you ask the average person who would have no idea, they think he was
yeah. Well, that's the funny thing, is because what was the population like then? Well, yeah, but look, he didn't just do these in San Francisco, and not that San Francisco is all that elevated. If you saw that gang that was hanging people and stuff, but he went off. He toured the whole state and went through the mining districts. You had these people out there digging in the dirt for gold. And a very rough crowd, and a very unpredictable crowd, and he took speeches like that all throughout the mining country, and also up into Oregon and even up to Vancouver and so on. He went all through these areas and made these speeches. And I mentioned in the book that there are reviews about him in the papers and so on, and people were captivated. They listened and they were engaged, and they actually learned. It's not like they didn't know. It's not like they knew who Socrates was out in the gold mining countries. In fact, there's this one funny story where he was walking through the town, and they had a poster up advertising, the speech, in which said, come tonight, Socrates and his time, or and his age. So it's a speech about Socrates and his age. And the one miner is scratching his head and says to the other one, Bill, who the hell is Socrates? And who the hell cares how old he was? That was how much they knew about it. Don't forget, in those days, most people didn't even go to school, In fact, none of these guys went to college. They did have some education, but mostly it was on their own. But a lot of people were lucky if they went to school for, 6 months or a year, and people could generally read, that was already part of American culture. But certainly most people were not familiar with these kind of topics any more than, than Americans are or people are today. And it wasn't what you would consider, practical use of speaking time and how you would win over a population to support a war effort, which is what he was doing, And he was, and through this combination of speeches, both the patriotic speeches and the philosophical speeches, he was lifting the population to a higher level of thinking than they ever were at before. And he was also a minister. He was giving sermons. His sermons also integrated these kind of ideas. He does a sermon on a comet, that was flying by overhead, and tells us we should always be happy at what astronomy can teach us about God, and he would bring all these things together. These weren't like different subjects. This was like all a one. Is like, how do you create American citizens? How do you create citizens of a republic that are capable of self-governing? And that's, it's not like he had ever read a book about how to do that. It's just this is how he thought about it himself, and it's the responsibility he took upon himself. Nobody told him to do this, at a certain point, he was getting requests. People were asking him to come and speak, but he had taken on this mission himself, to save the state and to, in so doing, in large part, save the country. And, I tell you, this slogan goes back, somebody even quotes it in those days, of somebody saying, well, as San Francisco goes, California goes, and as California goes, so the country goes. That quote already dates back to the 1860s, and which is kind of funny because California was way out there. It was at the end of the continent. There was no railroad connection. It was, considered the most, distant orbit of the country. But somehow it already had this kind of mystique about it. And throughout the war, even after the danger of immediate secession was pretty much overcome, still you had the rise of the Copperhead Faction. Yeah, these crazy Democrats from the North that wanted to stop the fighting. They wanted to just give up. They wanted to, just say that, that the South could do whatever they want and we should just go our own way. And yeah.
Thank you. Looking back at what we know now, do you think that the Copperhead faction, that they were paid agents of the British Crown or the Bank of England to disrupt the country?
Well, I don't have the pay stubs. I don't know that they were paid, but
does it seem like an intelligence operation to you?
Yeah.
Well, let me step in and not directly what you're asking, but very much related. If you look at the war in the Ukraine now, the way that some people describe the war is that it's a proxy war, right? That NATO, particularly the United States and Great Britain, but NATO is waging war against Russia using the Ukraine. That the Ukraine is merely the proxy with which to wage war against Russia. Well, that's what the American Civil War was. It was not a civil war. It was not a war between the states. It was a war against the United States by the British Empire, in which the South was merely the proxy for the British. Now, I'm not just making that claim. If you look at the war, um, first of all, what almost nobody realizes is that almost all, and if you think of the Revolutionary War, what was Ben Franklin? One of the things Ben Franklin was doing when he was in France, was trying to get weapons, right? Weapons and money that they could send back to the Continental Congress and to George Washington's army. Well, if you look at the Civil War, when the war started, the Confederate Army had a certain arsenal, mostly because they had seized the government arsenals in the South. So they had a certain amount of weapons and ammunition. They used almost all that up within 6 to 12 months. And they had no factories in the South to produce more, or very little. They couldn't produce anywhere near what they needed to keep an army in the field. And if you look at the Civil War from 1862 to 1865, almost all of the weapons and ammunition, including cannon, artillery, rifles, almost all of it was shipped to the South by the British out of Liverpool and elsewhere. The Battle of Gettysburg, Pickett's Charge. When they examined the dead Confederate soldiers on the field, the Union general or the Union officers, what they discovered was that 90% of those Confederate soldiers at the Battle of Gettysburg, 90% of them had rifles made in England. This was a proxy war. By the end of the war, the British were actually supplying most of the food to Robert E. Lee's army. When Robert E. Lee was, fighting Grant down around Petersburg and elsewhere before Appomattox, his soldiers were living off of rations shipped in from Britain. And meanwhile, the British were doing everything they could to support to give financial support to the Confederacy. Now, the British never entered the war, right? But they used the South. They were trying to destroy the Union, is what they were trying to do. Now, and also in our pamphlet, this pamphlet, I'll point to it. So this doesn't directly answer you about the Copperheads, but I think it is related. Our police dossiers, the British who murder our presidents. One of the chapters in here is on the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And the assassination of Abraham Lincoln was organized out of London and Montreal. And it was very much a British operation using Confederate agents. And John Wilkes Booth was a member of the Confederate Secret Service, which was run out of two places. Well, actually three places. Out of Richmond, out of Montreal, and out of Liverpool. That's where the British Secret Intelligence, the Confederate Secret Intelligence Service was run. And that was the operation which was used to assassinate Lincoln. So that's all. Again, that doesn't answer your question about the Copperheads, but I thought it was related to what you were asking.
Yeah, I mean, it's that's the backdrop of it, and
Yeah.
Whether every copper-headed politician actually knew that he was a British agent, probably they didn't, but they were still between the politicians and the newspapers. They had a whole string of news. I mean, they had a propaganda war. I mean, like that was no less, fanatical than what you have now. The only difference was that not all the newspapers were, pushing the same line, but you had these copperhead newspapers and copperhead politicians that were just constantly trying to brainwash the population about how the war was too expensive, that it wasn't worth fighting, that that it's not our business, that every argument that they could come up with to try to wear people down as to why to continue the war, And so this guy Thomas Starr King would just fight these things at every step of the way. And one of the speeches he makes is about I told you about Socrates. Well, there he talks about the method of sophistry, of lies, of how you twist things around to convince the population, to go with, as he puts it, to be the, to stick with the party line, or the or to be subservient to the powers of Zeus, the powers of the oligarchy. And it's he drew out the parallels, that this is the same exact kind of. He didn't necessarily say it that explicitly every time, but by making this whole method of Socrates clear, and then counteracting the whole arguments of the Copperheads, and how they were trying to brainwash the population. He really beat them down, and and anyway, the result of that after 4 years was that Lincoln won by a landslide in 1864. But I'm not trying to say it's just about votes, but it's about how to actually win people over, how to appeal to the best side of people, how to, as opposed to the way people think about politics a lot of the time, is to just come up with a gimmick, or come up with this or that, or how to, what are the hot button issues. So you had a rather remarkable group of people in California, in San Francisco especially, organizing to bring people to the highest levels of patriotic as well as general moral responsibility. So I can just stop there, and we can go on. Yeah.
So this goes back to your first point about how we haven't lived in a great era or something. But I feel that currently our economy is great. So here, but listen to this. Everyone here who's of working age can probably have enough to have a house and a family, but just not in San Francisco itself, right? So then, for example, houses even out in Reno. I was living in Reno, that's why I keep on bringing it up. Over there, the average, you could get a pretty good house for low 30s, low 300s. So that means you have to make about 65,000 a year to do that, and you could totally do that. And then people are inflating the fact that it costs so expensive to raise kids, but then they want to put them through these private schools or whatever. You could raise kids with anything. They're not they'll learn on their own. So I feel like we're almost pushing this idea where our country is in this doom and gloom phase, but it's not. We're actually really strong currently right now. For example, people like me and Arjun, we are the new middle class. We'll just make no more. But we are the middle class right now. We have the opportunities to hang out, have these great parties, listen to different ideas, and learn from everyone. And the thing is that it's because our economy is strong because of how we had our policies in the past. So I'm on the side of against the national bank, because I believe the free market can survive and has provided us with such opportunities as we have right now. Sure, there's different industry that has been broken down in the past, but what has risen is new industries that took their place and brought more jobs, more productivity, more wealth than we could ever imagine. For example, stuff like Apple, Google, or Meta, or Microsoft, or whatever, right? These companies are stuff that were created from the free market. And sure, we don't make any cars, we don't make that many cars, or we don't even make that many boats anymore. But what we do is we produce new products that the world has never ever seen. Everyone have these magical phones. If you think about this is an amazing piece of product. And the thing is, we are now building this. Same thing, we have built these AI products. We have built the idea of internet. That's something that's never been imagined. We have built all these things, but then it might not be the things which you guys associate as we consider productivity. But we brought internet infrastructure. Everyone can have cell phone that can call anyone from anywhere. These are all these amazing things that we have produced. And I think that is what we have done with our current free market economy. And, I don't think our country is in the doom and gloom phase. I think we are actually in a very strong and powerful phase. And the thing is it's just our point of views. I think if people change their point of views, or if they literally just move like 200 miles away, they can have a good job and a family and a house. But they all choose to do this rat race in San Francisco Bay Area, and a lot of it is their idea of why they want to be here. And sure, the world's changed. You know. Can't keep on talking. Okay. Okay. Well, okay, yeah. So I think the idea is that sure, like back, let's say 30 years ago, there's less people, there's more opportunities, but now more people moved in, and we have to adjust to that. Like you're not gonna be able to go buy a piece of property here in San Francisco because all the land has been taken up. There's just no more land. So a lot of the thing that people thought, that they did 30 years ago is just not reasonable because our city has grown and there's more people and they have to adjust for different factors.
I have this, yeah. Well, I mean, I'd say a couple of things. One is,
Yeah.
I mean, there's just a few things. I mean, look, you have to, on the one hand, you have to distinguish between, short-term speculative wealth and in-depth productive development. I mean, for instance, whenever you get one of these things, like, what the Federal Reserve did after 2007, right? When you had the 2007 bankruptcies. And they adopted the policy of quantitative easing. And we're going to print enormous amount of money, unprecedented amount of money, amounts of money that have never been seen before anywhere in human history. And we're going to pump this stuff out at basically 0% interest or close to 0% interest. And we're just going to flood the economy with it. Now, short term, what you get from that is you get buildings going up and this going up and that going up. I mean, remember before COVID, the Oakland skyline was filled with cranes, to build buildings. And it's not just Oakland. I mean, this is what you get. Pumping money out, a lot of which goes into real estate investment and things like that. That's a speculative boom. It might be very real in terms of how the money trickles down to people. Some people might get rich. There might be, for a while, a lot of construction jobs, but it's very temporary. It's not going to last. And ultimately, when it all comes due, you would have been better off letting the whole thing crash in the beginning, because when it does crash, the crash is going to be 10 times worse, because the financial bubble, the speculative bubble, is way, way bigger. Look, I'm not the one talking about doom and gloom for the financial system. I mean, this discussion is pervasive now, even among the elites, the central bankers, the World Economic Forum, this crowd, BlackRock, Larry Fink, all these people. They're really worried that this whole thing is ready to go, because, if you look at the amount of money that has been put into circulation, the amount of speculative income and speculative debt, in all kinds of things, from mortgage-backed securities to this, to that, to the other thing. It's just it is just an enormous financial bubble, which is not just a bubble, but they're financial demands. These are contracts which people have to honor and pay and what have you, or roll over the debt or pay the debt or make the interest payments on their debt or bundle their debt into some other kind of debt. And it's the ability to pay any of that is almost non-existent. And everything is leveraged out in every way possible. You know, so you know, you can't just look at the fact that we have cell phones or we have a few of these other technologies. Sure, you know, of course, we're now getting on most of these technologies where we did have a lead, you know, for a while. We're either not in the lead anymore or we're losing that lead. You know, I mean, you know, Intel and a couple of these other companies used to have almost a monopoly on microchips. Well, that's gone. You know, the best microchips in the world now are made in Taiwan and South Korea, mostly in Taiwan. Um, you know, cell phone technology. You know, it's. I mean, first of all, most of the cell phones and the chips in the cell phones and the software in the cell phones and all this stuff. Well, I don't know about the software, but the hardware. But it's made in Vietnam or India or Taiwan. We're not making anything here. And you know, you don't have a productive economy. Don't just think about the people working in Silicon Valley or the people working in a few areas like Silicon Valley, Austin, Texas, or what have you. You know, we have over 300 million people in this country. Now, most of them have cell phones, but other than having a cell phone, which in my view is a mixed blessing, other than having a cell phone, do any of these people living in Cleveland or Spokane or, you know, St. Louis or Memphis or Casper, Wyoming, are they really benefiting from the fact that people have cell phones, other than the fact that they have a cell phone and they can call anybody they want to at any time or check their email? Um, Look, let me give you another example in terms of what I mean by a productive economy. And some people say, "Well, you're."
Can I say something?
Well, let me say one thing, and you can do it. Because people think, "Well, you're talking about old industry. We're replacing the old industry with the new industry." Well, I don't think so. But let me give you one example. Um, Now we had a smaller population. I don't know what it was: 180 million, 200 million, 225 million. But in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, we did have 200 million people or so, a little more, a little less, living in the United States. We had massive industry. We had big cities, you know, with millions of people in them. You know, we had all kinds of things. There were never, and I mean never, I don't mean rarely, I mean never electricity blackouts or brownouts. Your electricity did not go off even for 1 minute a year because we had overproduction of electricity. We had redundancy built into the delivery systems. We had redundancy built into the transformers, right? We had a surplus of what we needed. And the electricity cost a lot less than it does now. So we had a steady supply of energy. I mean, now you could live almost anywhere in the country, and you're going to, at the minimum, have temporary brownouts, you know, if not extended blackouts. We have an energy system in this country which is stretched so thin, it's at the verge of catastrophe, literally. We have the same thing with our water systems. We are on the verge of running out of fresh water in major parts of the country. This is what I mean by an in-depth, productive economy. We used to have it. We don't have it anymore. And, you know, we could just keep on going the way we're going, but at a certain point, the electricity is going to go off and none of the cell phone towers are going to work. You know what? So Andrea, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to make one kind of obvious point. You hold up as a model for prosperity, Reno, Nevada. Now, what exactly is the source of prosperity in Reno?
All right, so they do have gambling, but a lot of the industry actually is just it's like dispersed services around the city for various things, right? So
But
they
various things related to gambling.
well, no, like a sure, yeah, entertainment. But a lot of it is literally like they have like they have contractors who build things. There's a lot of construction companies in the area. Like sure, like gaming is definitely one of the main parts of it. But then like there was a very dispersed industry, and the gaming industry has been in significant decline in Reno for almost the last 15 years. So like the revenue share that's coming from the gaming industry is dropping significantly, and then they have been diversifying their overall economy. So Reno has a University of Reno, which has the second best mining school in the nation after the Colorado School of Mines. Yeah. Yeah. So but even that, so Reno is a hub for a lot of mining, right? So all the mining in Nevada, they would go to Reno because it's the northern part of Nevada.
Yeah, well, traditionally, since World War II, you've had almost two distinct economies in Nevada. You know, you had an economy based on mining and raw materials extraction and things like that. You know, which has been very useful, very productive. I don't know what the status of it is today. I just don't keep up on Nevada's economy. But then you've had the gambling industry, which, you know, you can't eat poker chips, you know? Um, you know, I mean, I would argue to you that what's happened to agriculture in this country is in reality a national security threat. The idea that we import more than 50% of our food, well, we saw what could happen to supply chains during COVID. What happens if there is a war? What happens if something else happens? I mean, you could figure out a lot of scenarios. But what happens if at a certain point we no longer have access to a lot of this food that's being imported? You don't restart that in 6 months. It takes years and years and years to build up a productive agricultural sector. No, no, no. In grains. But yeah, but in grains, particularly wheat and corn, you know, and I maybe soybeans, I don't know. But but you know, the majority of vegetables, and I believe at this point, I'm not, you know, I haven't looked at the statistic lately. If it's not a majority, it's close to a majority of the meat and poultry we eat and the vegetables and fruits we eat are all imported, the majority. And that's not secure. And it was not a good idea to let that situation develop. It was all part of free trade. Started with NAFTA and then went on from there because we could buy it cheaper there, cheaper. That was the outlook of the financial deregulation in the 1990s. We could buy things cheaper from China. You know, William McKinley, when he was president, you know, he used to run against this guy named William Jennings Bryan, and he ran against, you know, but, you know, the Democrats back then were all big believers in free trade. And McKinley was the believer in tariffs. Big. He was probably like the most pro-tariff president we ever had. And McKinley said, we are not a nation of low prices and low wages. We're a nation of high prices and high wages. We're going to develop our industry, our manufacturing. We're going to produce. And if you have a productive economy, then people can afford to buy things at a higher price.
That's a great segue into my next.
All right.
So I got a great question from online.
Okay.
We have a question. Cha Walker asks, how would a national bank differ from the Federal Reserve? What banking and currency policies would a national bank put forth?
Well, it'd be completely different, but you have to, you'd really have to study it. I wrote a book on national banking, and it's pretty good. I'm not going to claim it's perfect, but it's a pretty good book and it's very thorough. And the first thing you have to understand is that the intention is entirely different. Because people want to say, well, is the government going to run everything? Wasn't Hamilton's national bank really just a central bank, which it was not? It had nothing in common with a central bank. But you can't just look at the specifics of the details. If you want to understand what a national bank is, you have to go back and read what Hamilton wrote about it. He wrote the report on the national bank. He wrote the report on the public credit. He wrote the report on manufacturers. And he wrote his opinion on the constitutionality of the national bank, why it's constitutional. And it's very clear what he's saying, which is that our goal is to develop the country, the productive economy of the country. That's our goal, right? Because what we want is a future where future generations are more productive, have a higher standard of living, and have more opportunity than we who are living here today have. We want economic progress. And we're going to develop a national bank and a credit system in which the intention is to build up the productive economy and the productivity of the economy and the productivity of the individual citizen, individual worker. Progress, economic progress, right? Well, that's not the intention of the Federal Reserve. The intention of the Federal Reserve is to manage a money system. That's what it is. They print Federal Reserve notes. These Federal Reserve notes are pumped into Wall Street, into what they call their primary lenders, Citicorp, JP Morgan Chase, these other institutions. This money then flows into various kinds of money markets. Look, you have to look at these big Wall Street banks today. They have enormous, what they claim as assets. I don't just mean deposits, but what they claim as their financial assets, their financial portfolio, right? And, if you add up these major banks, like the say 7, 8, 9, 10 largest banks in the United States, the total financial assets of these banks, you're talking about trillions and trillions of dollars. Now, the reality is very little of that money gets invested productively. Very little of that money actually builds anything at all. It's all going into various kinds of gambling casinos, speculative investments, of which there are now thousands of kinds of doing this. Futures markets, options markets, this, that, and the other thing, derivatives trading, over-the-counter trading, and it's all, mortgage-backed securities that I mentioned before, where, it used to be like in the days of, Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life, if you were George Bailey, you went to the bank, you got a mortgage, you built a house. The bank held the mortgage, you paid the mortgage down, and when you made the last payment, they handed you the mortgage and you burnt it, right? That was American home owning, right? Well, now these banks make these mortgage loans, and first of all, they're much longer term now than they used to be. Mortgage used to be 20 years back in the 1950s. I think a lot of them are 40 years now. I don't really know. I don't, but 30 years. All right, but they take these mortgages And when they accumulate large numbers of them, totaling in the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, they bundle them. Some of you may know about this stuff. They bundle them. And then they sell them as an investment to someone else based on how much they can get for them. And then the person they sell that investment to, can either unbundle them or package them with something else and sell that as an investment. And this can go on through a chain. And sooner or later, and each time what the individual investor is looking for is that sliver of profit, that little margin of profit on that financial transaction, right? So it's all about monetary profit. It's all about monetary profit. And the way this mortgage-backed security thing works is if you let this go on for 10 or 20 or 30 years, you find far more money being invested into these mortgage-backed securities, which are purely financial investments, which don't build anything. Far more money going into the mortgage-backed securities than the money that actually went into building the homes to begin with. So building the homes is no longer the issue. It's no longer even the primary concern. The primary concern is to create these vehicles through which financial speculation can be carried out. That's the kind of financial system we have today. We have to get rid of that. A lot of people are not aware of the fact that most of this, you may not believe me, you may think I'm making this up. Most of the financial investments that go on today, and we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars or more, most of the financial investments that go on right now were illegal 40 years ago. Illegal, against the law. Options trading was against the law. Derivatives did not exist. Mortgage-backed securities did not exist. This all was part of the financial deregulation of the 1990s under Bush and Clinton, right? And NAFTA was part of that. We're no longer going to be a productive economy. Everything is going to become financialized. A company is no longer valued for what it manufactures. A company is now valued for its financial value in the marketplace, right? Everything becomes financialized with a dollar attached to it. So to get back to the question on national banking, what we need to do is to shut down the vast majority of this financial speculation, outlaw it, shut it down, and begin to issue sovereign U.S. currency, U.S. dollars. We should withdraw the Federal Reserve notes, not all at once, obviously, you've got to have a transition, but withdraw the Federal Reserve notes, begin to issue U.S. dollars through a national bank, which will then be loaned out through a network of private banks around the country for productive investment. Now you could say, well, how are you going to determine who the private banks loan things out to or not? Well, first of all, a lot of the things that banks loan out to right now, you make illegal again, as they were illegal. You begin to get tax incentives and other kinds of incentives that Trump tried to do in bringing manufacturing back to the country, starting up small businesses. A lot of these entrepreneurs that people are excited about. Because you're right, there are a lot of entrepreneurs right now. There are just not enough of them, and they're starved for cash. A lot of them. I mean, you have people doing all kinds of projects on fusion energy and this and that and rockets and transportation systems and people with brainchilds. all over the country, there are people doing this. And they're starved for money. They can't get money, most of these people. They can't get anywhere unless they could find an investor. They're looking for the investor. But they can't get loans from banks because banks won't loan money out to this kind of stuff anymore. That's what they say. But that's what banks used to do, you know? And we need a banking system which is actually going to finance a productive economy, not a gambling casino. And the Federal Reserve System is a gambling casino. And we need national banks. Now, I'm not a big fan of government bureaucrats running anything, but the fact of the matter is, you've got to have some kind of government oversight. When they had the national bank, and it was done differently under Lincoln. Lincoln's system was a little bit different, but it was similar but different. But the national bank under Hamilton, it was a public-private partnership, right? But 25% of the money in the bank was 25% of the ownership of the bank was owned by the U.S. Treasury Department. They owned 25% of it. The other 75% were owned by private investors. The Treasury Department, the Treasury Department also had, I think, 3 out of the 9 directors of the bank. So they had like a third of the directors. Also, the officials of the bank had to write a report on the operations of the bank. In other words, a detailed report on the operations of the bank, and submit that to the Treasury Department every week, every single week. And without foreknowledge, without giving notice, the Treasury Department was authorized to go into the bank on any day they chose with a surprise visit and audit the books of the banks, examine the books of the bank, was it Ron Paul has been calling for auditing the Federal Reserve for the last 40 years, good luck on that. But they were authorized to do this. So the bank was not run by the government, but it was run under very close watching and supervision and participation of the Department of Treasury, right? Which is what the Constitution says. The Constitution says that the United States government has a monopoly. Now, if you don't like this, okay, but it's what the Constitution says. The U.S. government, which is the government of the people, has a monopoly on the issuance of money. Only the U.S. government is allowed to issue money. And only the U.S. government is allowed to determine how that money is then put into circulation. That's our constitutional system. And the national bank is merely a vehicle by which you do that. But that's not how the Federal Reserve works. Federal Reserve prints Federal Reserve notes. They print as many as they want. They don't get approval from Congress. Like when Lincoln printed the greenbacks during the Civil War, every time he wanted to print the greenbacks, he'd say, I want to print $100 million more of greenbacks. Congress had to authorize that. Congress voted to issue $100 million in greenbacks. And then they would be issued, and the Treasury Department would distribute them through the national banking system. So, but that's not how the Federal Reserve works. They just print. They just turn the printing presses on, and they print and print and print and print, and no one in Congress stops them. And the money almost entirely goes into speculation. And people, you have enormous wealth among a very small percentage of the population. It's an insane system. So I don't know if that answers his question or not, but that's what I would say. I'm being a little long-winded here.
You said early on that you weren't answering the question, but I think you got to it.
Yeah.
Quick follow-up question. How does gold play into a national bank?
Well, that's a complicated issue, but we should go back. I don't really want to devote a lot of time to this. We should go back to a gold reserve system. We should have a fixed exchange rate for gold. That's not a gold standard. People get them confused. A gold standard is what we had before 1933. And this was the British gold standard. It was invented in London around 1815. And it was the British gold standard through the 19th century. And, under the supposed rules of the gold standard, which people violated all the time. I mean, it was ignored anyway. It was violated anyway. But according to the rules of the gold standard, you're not supposed to print more money than you have gold. That you're limited to the actual gold and silver to gold and silver you have, and you're only allowed to print enough money so that if everyone turned all their money in all at the same time, you could redeem it in gold and silver. But that was abolished in 1933. And what we had in the Depression, World War II, the 1950s, 1960s, is we had the gold reserve system. And that's a very complicated subject. But the importance of it is a fixed exchange rate, that currencies are pegged to gold, to a value of gold. And that's important for a lot of reasons, particularly, world trade, contracts, because if you have these floating exchange rates like we have today, we've had since the 1970s and 80s, you sign a contract to take delivery on something, in dollars, and those dollars may have a much different price to gold when that contract comes due. What the floating exchange rate does, and also the currencies fluctuate. I mean, like you talk about speculation. One of the biggest areas of financial speculation in the world is currency speculation. People buying, selling currencies. This currency is going up. That currency is going down. The peso dropped. The yen is up. The ruble is crashing. And people are going to speculate on these currencies as if the currencies are, financial commodities or something. Or, a currency is a sovereign currency of a nation. And speculators don't determine what it's worth. Speculators do not determine what your currency is worth. Your currency is a sovereign currency of your nation. And what you get with a fixed exchange rate is you get an agreement among sovereign nations, an agreement among the United States, Brazil, Germany, Japan, wherever, that we're going to fix the exchange rates, and that is, how these currencies are going to be traded. And you wipe out currency speculation, right? So we need to go back to a fixed exchange rate for gold. Gold has no real bearing on the issuance of dollars. Not really. Because unlike what most people think, you get this from these talking heads on the internet. You print more money and you get inflation. You print less money and you get deflation. Well, that's not really true, because it depends on what you do with the money. If you print $5 trillion and use it to speculate in financial gambling where you're not producing anything, then you have more and more money chasing fewer and fewer goods. The money becomes almost worthless. But if you're printing money and you're using it to build hydroelectric dams, nuclear power plants, manufacturing plants, modern agriculture, and you're actually building up your productive economy, if you do it carefully and wisely, you got to be careful. But if you do it carefully and wisely, you can print a hell of a lot of money without any inflation at all, with no inflation. And it's what you do with the money, you know? That's what's important. What are you going to do with it? You're going to take it off to Las Vegas and gambling with it? Or are you going to build some plant here in Oakland, which employs 1,000 people to produce something and give them a job and a decent standard of living and a way to raise their families? You know? So anyway, yeah,
Is this okay?
yeah.
Well, you touched on so many things. I don't know if I can remember everything I wanted to say, but I think I'm going to go back and just comment on what you said about energy.
Mhm.
Do you really think we have brownouts because there is a lack of energy?
Oh, sure.
You think so? Okay. Well, I do not think so. I think this is manufactured energy crisis that we have.
Well, I'm not
So
going to
they
argue
want to
that.
control that.
I'm not
And
gonna argue- look,
secondly,
Yeah,
yeah.
go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
It's just a different opinion.
Mhm.
But secondly, there's no scarcity of water. That's also a manufactured crisis. Water does not come only from melting ice or rain. We have primary water. You can go to primarywater.org and you see that there is water that is generated all time. There is no lack of water on this. This is a water planet. Thirdly, the productive economy everywhere, not only in the US, is also a manufactured crisis because we could be really productive if they just didn't destroy the farmland, didn't cut off water to the farmers, didn't cut off electricity to industries, and didn't destroy,
Yeah.
the population, making them sick, not being able to do anything but go to the doctor. So, and then, okay, so fixed interest rates. If you sell something to another country and the currency rate is fixed, will you get exactly the same amount 6 months later? Or what do you mean by
Yes,
fixing it? Okay,
Fixed.
so it's fixed forever.
Well, it doesn't have to be forever.
Is that really going to work?
You can have renegotiations if at a certain point, it becomes apparent that, a country's currency is massively, seriously overvalued or undervalued. Well, then what you need is an arrangement whereby nations can, renegotiate these values. But this should not be done every year or every 6 months. You talk. I'm
Renegotiate
not
the
gonna
rate,
put a
yeah.
date on it. What you do is you say, we're nations. I mean, if we can stop having these wars around the world, and if we can begin to do business with each other and learn to live with each other around the world, and say we all really want a productive economy, even though we have completely different political systems, you can, the you can have an arrangement where if problems, serious monetary problems, arise from time to time, then the nations would come together and discuss it and say, well, we need to straighten some of these things out. There's inequalities or there's problems that have arisen.
The nations then should decide we're going to do this every year or every 3 years or every 5 years. That sounds like a very controlled economy. And who in these nations are actually going to decide that? I was asking because you also do it's kind of not nuanced and not very sophisticated when you say, all these financial speculations like options and futures, whatever. That's how companies reduce their risk when they do sell to other countries.
They reduce their financial risk.
Yes. So there has to be a counterpart on the other side. Otherwise, they could not buy that insurance policy to secure their income 6 months or a year from
Well,
now.
how come we
And you
didn't
call
need-
that a bad thing?
How come
It
we
depends
can't-
on how the
come
society.
We did not need any of that stuff in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s when we had the most productive economy in history.
Well, I'm sure that they didn't have so much international trade, maybe.
They had plenty of
And they
international
lost a
trade.
lot of money. So somebody came up with the idea that maybe we should have the ability to sell forward what our income is going to be in 6 months. Otherwise, we may be totally wiped out.
No,
So
it's all
this-
speculation. It's
I
all
mean,
it's
there-
all risk management of speculation.
It's risk management, but you have to have somebody on the other side who speculates on that. Otherwise, you can't reduce your risk. I agree. It's totally
No, I'm not saying it's legitimate risk
derivatives,
management.
and there are
I'm saying
derivatives
it's
of
risk
derivatives.
management of speculation. You don't want cut out the speculation. You don't need the risk management.
Okay. Well, I agree that the financial market is kind of out of it because there are derivatives on derivatives, and the banks play both sides. And I agree that it's totally
Yeah,
bad. But
okay.
not
All right,
not everything is bad, because you have to have a fair amount of speculation so that you can reduce your risk if you
No,
do
you
business.
don't. You just don't.
Unless you have a totally controlled economy.
It's
and
not a question of a controlled
nations,
economy.
governments decide everything, what the exchange rate is going to be. Isn't
It's
that what
not
they
a
do in
controlled
China?
economy. You have companies. Some company that makes machine tools. That's some company that makes a certain kind of engine. Some company that makes a certain kind of glass. Some company that has a certain kind of food. And they're buying and selling this stuff to other people in other countries. You have trade. You're buying these things. You sign contracts to buy them. You buy them at a certain rate, and they're paid for at a certain rate. That's not control. These companies are free to buy and sell all over the world. You know, that there's no control there at all. You know, and the
That's called a future contract.
That's
But
not a-
anyway, okay, so
no.
we disagree on that then a little bit. But
a
the
future,
national
look,
bank.
look, yeah, but you're talking, and a lot of things you're saying are just not right. Futures contracts are not the same as options contracts. You sign a futures contract for delivery at a future date, but in a rational economy, what you're paying for it now, and the price at delivery doesn't change. It's the same.
Fix it.
That's right. You
Yeah,
fixed
you
it.
decide on the price now.
And
Of
the
course.
now
That's the whole idea.
it's possible that you could sign a contract where you say, I will agree to pay you in the future at a different price than what you're paying right now. Right? You could do that.
Well, of
But
course
it's
you
still
do.
a fixed contract.
It's still a futures contract.
Look, you're making it's semantics. Options trading,
I'm not done.
options trading, and the kind of things you're talking about were all illegal until the 1990s. Illegal,
Okay.
and there was no reason to legalize them.
We
But
can-
no, I want to get back to what you said earlier on energy and water, because you're just completely wrong. Now there are. I'm not going to say that you can't. That there aren't manufactured crises. Of course, there are manufactured crises. But if you look at the amount of kilowatt hours, now this is not a question of speculation. It's not a question of guesswork. If you look at the amount of kilowatt hours of electricity that is produced in the United States today, and per capita, per human individual, and you compare it to the amount of kilowatt hours that was produced per capita 30 years ago, we produce far less electricity per capita today than we did 30 years ago. That's not false. Not per capita. And if you look at water, it's the same thing. I know what primary water is. I know what underground aquifers are. I know about the river runoffs and all of this. But if you look at the water systems in the United States and their ability to deliver fresh water, we are in a profound crisis right now. This is not guesswork. It's a profound crisis. We have whole sections of this country where it's touch and go in terms of water supplies. Now that's not the only sense in that it's manufactured, because you could say it's manufactured.
That's all I'm saying.
But the only way in which
we're
it's
agreeing on
manufactured,
that. I just it's manufactured.
but
and
the only
it's
way it
because
is
of the
manufactured
governments.
is
Mhm.
that we have not developed and expanded our fresh water supplies, and that is going to take an enormous amount of investment and an enormous amount of work. So that's what I would say. You have to look at what we produce per capita, how much energy we use per capita, how much manufacturing we have per capita. You have to look at these things as sort of measurements of how productive your economy is. And we've been getting less and less and less productive. So anyway, I don't know. We getting towards the end, Arjun, or how late are we going? Oh, people are probably tired of listening to me. People should ask Andrea questions. She gave us all a challenge on great Californians. There have been truly great Californians. Not a lot of them lately, but there have been.
I guess speaking of California, I was curious about whether it has to be a national bank. Could it be one or more state banks?
Yeah.
And I also was curious about what could a transition, like what could be a transitional step on the way to a national bank be? If it had to be a national bank, could a transitional step be a state bank or a Bank of San Francisco?
Yeah. Well, this has been tried before, and there are some people who poo-poo the idea of state banks. I'm not one of them, but they don't replace a national bank. But there have been in the past, in American history, I think particularly in the 20th century, but it might have gone back to the 19th century, a number of states which set up state banks. There still is one that exists to this day, which is the Bank of North Dakota. But other states did it as well. It was never like most of the states, but a handful of states did do this. I think Idaho did it at one point. And this is what Huey Long was trying to do in Louisiana, was set up a state bank. And he was, of course, destroyed politically. But but a number of states did do this or try to do it. And the idea being that, with some of these, a lot of this was back in the 20s and 30s, was that we have an economic crisis in the state. We need to build roads. We need to build schools. We need to build things, water projects, whatever it is. We need, transportation. We have things we need to build. And we have farmers and other people who also need loans, right? So we're going to set up a state bank, and we're going to, provide loans for people who need loans for investment, productive investment. And we're also going to invest some of the money in infrastructure and things like that, have a state bank to do it. And like I said, it's been done before. I don't see why it couldn't be done today. That's just my personal view. It does not represent the view of LaRouche PAC. But it's, I don't see why you couldn't do that today. For instance, they're having this, hell of a time trying to build this high-speed rail thing in the Central Valley. Now, I know a lot of people think the high-speed rail thing is a complete boondoggle. I'm for it myself. I think we should have maglev trains and high-speed rail. Well, at least let's start with high-speed rail, and then we can move on to maglev if it works good enough. I think we should have these things all over the United States. I think we should have thousands of miles of them. But, that's just my view. And really, don't get in an argument with me about that. That's not part of the official presentation. But just take that as an example. You know, people are trying to build this thing, and this high-speed rail line from Los Angeles to the Bay Area. Well, rather than try to pay for it out of government revenue, or rather than float bonds, which the taxpayers then have to pay back at some usurious interest rate, if you had a state bank, you could loan some of the money out to build that. You know, payable in 40 years, payable in 40 years when the thing is up and running, paid for out of revenue you're getting from this system, right? You could do things like that. A state bank could do things like that. I mean, some of the projects might be too big for a state bank. Now, the big drawback of a state bank, or two drawbacks, but they're very much related, is that if you set up a state bank right now, it has to operate within the Federal Reserve System, you know, because the Federal Reserve System prints all the money and controls everything. So you would be within the constraints of how the Federal Reserve System works. And the more fundamental problem is that states can't print their own money. The national government can print money. The national government could take a national bank. This is sort of like what Lincoln did with the greenbacks. They just printed the money, right? They didn't borrow the money. See, we're used to having the government borrow money. We borrow money, right? What Lincoln did with the greenbacks is they didn't borrow the money. They passed legislation in Congress. Lincoln signed it into law, and they printed $200 million. And they said, this is currency, and we're printing it. They didn't borrow it from anybody. They just printed it. And you could print today, let's say, start small, $1 billion of US currency. You could deposit that in a national bank, and then the national bank could then loan that money out for productive use. So instead of the government borrowing money from Wall Street, what would actually happen is people who needed loans for some investments would borrow US dollars from the national bank. It's kind of like the opposite way around. Oh, sure, you pay interest. Because, you know, money's not free. You know, what if you, yeah, and then what if they lose the money and you don't get paid back?
Also, you're talking about a much lower rate of interest than what they would.
Well, however it's worked out, you have to have secured loans, and you know, although there's no reason, like one of the things LaRouche proposed a long time ago, and I don't know if he continued to support it when he got older, but when he was much younger, and he was thinking about ways to reform the banking system, is he proposed what he called a two-tier credit policy. And he said, you know, we should distinguish between productive and non-productive investments. You know, and you know, I mean, obviously you'd have to adjust this, and it would be open for discussion. You know, no one's going to really dictate it, but open for discussion of what's productive, what's non-productive. But like, for instance, you know, building, you know, a factory that produces something is productive. Building a gambling casino is not productive. But there are a lot of things obviously in the gray zone. So it would be hard to figure it out. But what he said was a two-tier credit system where we would loan money out at 1% or 2% for productive investment, very low interest rates, and loan money out at 6 to 9% for non-productive investment. So people who wanted to borrow money to do something useless with it could still borrow it, but they'd have to pay a higher interest. Now, I don't know if that would really work or not, but the intention is clear. You're trying to maximize productive investment. Is what you're trying to do, you know. And a state bank, I don't see how it could hurt. You know, I don't see how it could hurt. And in terms of a transition to a national bank, I don't think we should have a transition. I think we should just abolish the Federal Reserve and replace it with a national bank and withdraw all the Federal Reserve notes. But there are things you could do short of that. Like if you look at what Franklin Roosevelt did with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and people, Republicans who don't like Franklin Roosevelt should study the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. This was brilliant. This was an agency that was set up actually by Herbert Hoover. But Herbert Hoover used it to, he called it the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or RFC, Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And what Hoover did is he used it to bail out the banks. Because this was like after 1929, after the stock market crash, you had bank failures all over the place. So Hoover said, well, we can't let all these banks go under. We're going to bail out the banks. And maybe some of that was necessary. I don't know. But he called it the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. When Roosevelt came in, they renamed it to the Reconstruction, I don't know what it was called.
Well, I think he had the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Hoover must have called it something else.
Yeah, he was the Reconstruction. It was a different name. I can't remember the name. But what they did is they changed the approach. I think they still did try to shore up some of these banks. But first of all, Roosevelt massively increased the capitalization of this thing. And he essentially turned it into a bank. It was never legally a bank. It was a government corporation, and it never had a bank charter. But they capitalized it with an enormous amount of government money. And the job of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation after 1933-34 was to loan money out all across the United States for all kinds of projects. Some were government projects like building bridges and things. Others were into private enterprise. And by I forget the year, it was like 38 or 39, right before World War II, the Reconstruction Finance, and I know that this is true, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in one of those years, right before World War II, loaned out more money in the United States than the top 10 Wall Street banks combined. Right? They were just loaning out hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And it went into all kinds of things. Factories, farms, fisheries, this, that, the other thing. I mean, and this was not like the WPA project or the CCC camps, where we had these government projects public works projects, where the government spent money directly out of the budget to build something, Roosevelt did that too. But the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was not a public works project. These were loans. They loaned the money out. And when they finally went out of business during World War II, I think it was 43 or 42, when the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was shut down. At the point it was shut down, it was in the black. Almost all of its loans had been paid back. So by capitalizing this thing and setting it up as a quasi-bank and loaning out enormous amounts of money for economic development, not only did we get all economic development, but in the end, it didn't cost us a dime. Not a penny. Not a penny. Because all the money came back. So that's something you could do short of a national bank. There's no reason we couldn't do that today. There's no reason. I mean, what happened in 1933 was Roosevelt took this agency. Well, first of all, Hoover started the agency. Congress passed a bill. Hoover signed it. It was started. Then Roosevelt took the agency and said, well, we're going to just change how this agency operates. And I don't know if he did that through executive order. I don't really know. But they transformed the agency into becoming this gigantic lender of productive investment. And it worked phenomenally in terms of the effect it had on the country economically. So I don't know if that is useful. I'm talked out. I don't really want to keep talking.
Yes, so if everyone wants to give a little round of applause for our speakers.
I hope I didn't offend anybody. We have some differences of opinion, as you always get when you get a group of people together.
So thank you very much, Bob, Andrea,
Yeah.
and everyone that joined us for the evening, both here in person, live, and online. You can submit questions if you want. I'm going to volunteer something that I haven't cleared with the authors. Either they or I will respond if you have anything you would like to leave online. Thank you.
All right. Okay.
Getting a sore throat or something?
Yeah, yeah. I'm talked out. Talking too much. Too much.